I can't hear either.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it
Oh
was my
boy,
sound or.
restructure out now. Figure out how to use the mute button here. But thanks everybody for joining the session to Know Your MIP. This is session 18, and I'm Retro, intern facilitator for the Collateral Engineering Services Core Unit, and I'm joined by Juan, the facilitator at the Sustainable Ecosystem Scaling Core Unit, and together we're coining the brand name of the ecosystem cluster for now. And today we're here to talk about the DAO-level objectives and work proposal frameworks that are currently in RFC entering the frozen period here this week. Appreciate Long and others joining that have provided some feedback around it. What I'd like to do today is just give a brief overview, recapping some of the things that were talked about on the GNR, and then we could dive into the MIPs themselves for going into more of the details for the MIPs and things that could potentially be improved. Kicking things off then, this is again really the evolution of the project-based budgeting that we presented back in August, which really talked about separating the work from the workforce and aligning expectations around funding and the creation of value. The overall goal of this MIP set was to create a refresh of governance tools in a sense, while not forcing or creating any massive changes, but just pivoting some of the existing frameworks that we've been using for a while to the more mature state and get them endgame ready. And then overall, the overall design of the MIPs is to make them this platform for iterative changes and learnings to be incorporated, similar to a framework, but using a MIP as the platform for that in the short term. When we say the term DLO, that's short for DAO-level Objective again, and this is really a document or a proposal that defines work and sets expectations around deliverables. We'll get into the specifics of this a little bit later once we actually start looking at the MIPs. But the important thing to highlight here is that it encourages explicit outcomes. And it's, again, that platform that could potentially unlock other concepts for the DAO, like budgeting across the entire DAO and projects, or a lightweight prioritization mechanism as well. Work proposals then are the vehicle that's more similar to, say, a MIP40 or an SBF. This is for assigning the work to a team, as well as describing maybe some of the intangibles or the competitive advantages of that team that's working to win the opportunity from the DAO and deliver the work. And it also creates an environment for competition to manifest between the teams, compare them a little bit better if there are multiple submitters, or at least give governance insights into how the work will be done, potentially any challenges that may pop up. And again, just further refine expectations, but this side, it's focused on the workforce delivering the work instead of defining the overall outcome and the value. And what we are hoping to drive with this process is focusing on the graphic in the bottom middle, is having these two concepts meet. Focus on work would create more value in both the short term and the long term compared to some of the current frameworks that we're using today. And then overall fitting in with governance, just before, again, we dive into the MIPs themselves. Right now, we're trying to design a process that basically has each sub-proposal in a RFC frozen and voting period of about a month. So from submission to ratification, it's about 30 days or 4 weeks. Open to any feedback there before we lock the MIP down for frozen. And looking forward to the discussion with Long about some of the improvements that we can make in the short term, or potentially see if it's better to hold off on these. So with this, let's go ahead and dive into the MIPs before we get into the example here. The example that was worked up was showcasing the main reason why we think there's value in getting these MIPs approved in the short term, which is it fills some of the gaps and directions that core units have been expressing in the short term for this pre-game phase, to enable a pathway for them to spin off into ecosystem actors successfully, but also give governance the ability to manage that entire process of 17 teams potentially transitioning into independent startups in a consistent and structured way. So let's hop over to the MIPs. If you guys can see my screen, this is MIP97, which is the DAO-level Objective Framework. And please, this is meant to be interactive. Happy to monologue up here, but if there's any available input or places that we'd like to take this discussion today, we're happy to have this audience led, since we spent a lot of time on the GNR talking about some of these concepts already.
I was actually going to ask if there are any questions or comments. I think that the main motivation, and to summarize it in 30 seconds, the idea of this is to separate the work from the implementation. So, for example, someone, or we notice that in some cases, some core units, let me see if I can. So some core units actually, when they present a budget, the conversation is very different from this core unit will not be able to deliver, we do not like the implementation, versus this work needs to be done, but not by this core unit. So one is, should we do this? And the other one is how and who should do it. So the idea of this is mainly to separate that thing, which has been contaminating the discussion the last couple of months / years. And the other thing that we were intending is, right now we have the MIP13, which is declaration of intent, which is very non-concrete, let's say. So with this, one could actually propose like, hey, we would like to have this work done. These are the milestones to hit, and potentially attach like a budget. And if that gets approved, that's pretty much signaling the whole community like, hey, Maker is, I don't know, it's almost like a job description or a job opening where people can say like, yeah, this is great, we want to do it, so we'll submit a work proposal to that. That has not been happening yet, so it was harder for the more active delegates. For example, we have Frank or Rob here that were actually contributing with different MIPs. So this could be another tool for them to actually go ahead and propose something that's more concrete. Yeah, I don't know if there's any comments or we can keep going.
Yeah, can you clarify the 17? Is that 17 team members or 17 work proposals? Workforce teams, okay.
Yeah, there would be 17 separate teams and the restrictions underneath that team. So if there wanted to be some sort of credentials or something proven as we continue down endgame, that could potentially be different badges or reputation-based NFTs that are required in order to allow somebody to basically qualify. Then the thinking being some projects could be open, could be more of like a bounty to do this work, submit it, and potentially receive payment through the work proposal. But as this example's doctored up, it's showing that you have to be a core unit, and it's available to all 17 core units, with the limiting factor of this being an overall 2 million budget cap that's defined for this overall project.
So a DLO can be submitted also by a ecosystem actor, right? So if you're working with a creator MakerDAO and you have a marketing idea as an example, you could ideally create a DLO. Is that correct? Or
yeah, in the current structure as well, I think the better example here may be something say better related to endgame products. So a DLO could be created for the creation of Elixir, saying that it's outside of the current scope of work and mandate, and teams potentially need to expand. Teams that want to submit to contribute to the Elixir project then would submit a work proposal that basically says, here's our funding request. The DLO would and could potentially request specific reporting parameters. So if we want the project to be run more as a core unit, the auditing framework, for an example, could be the requested reporting method. Otherwise, it could be presented as a single line item. So it's more of a vendor type relationship, like basically saying, here's the budget for the project, you manage your funds correctly. And we really don't need to see that insight into the HR and some of the complexities that the end game is trying to move the DAO away from.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think that if an ecosystem actor wants to work on something that there's no DLO for, that means that governance has not yet approved that objective, meaning that they potentially work or they want to work on a direction that Maker hasn't considered yet. So in that case, we do envision an ecosystem actor actually proposing a DLO. And of course, if you're proposing a solution, you should address the objective of the problem that you're trying to solve or improve. So we think that this is a good discussion. That's point number one. And point number two, this will actually help with competition, right? Because I don't know, let's say that who's here? Let's say that Peyton, right? Okay, governance needs to do A, B, and C. Then potentially Go Alpha has a good work proposal to work on that DLO, but anyone could come, any ecosystem actor could come and be like, oh, we actually have, we can do it for cheaper, or we have this other idea on how it can be implemented, or we have experience doing this and that. So that's potentially the better way to actually do things, or at least that's what we believe when proposing this.
Yeah, and to touch on the comment that Lewis just made too, talking about potentially rewording the example provided here. That's the whole point of the RFC process. So teams and delegates, or potentially teams that want to submit a work proposal against it, can engage during the overall deal clarification stage of drafting a DLO to clarify some of these words. But just to highlight, this is just an example, so it's not one that we would actively look to put up in its current state. It's just to showcase the DLOs and work proposal flows.
Could I comment briefly on the EAs making DLO proposals?
Please.
So I'm wondering if you're going to end up in a situation where EAs submit both a DLO and a what's the one called? Regardless, they submit both at the same time, right? So a proposal onto MIP 97 and 98, and that'll mean that the DLOs proposed like that will always be kind of specifically written to only fit, well, not only fit, but primarily fit one EA's what they want, right? So I'm wondering if it's worth having some sort of guard in there, right, that says something like, you can't propose both from the same person in the same cycle or something, right? So there's at least a month for other EAs to look at it and potentially compete. I mean, obviously governance can kind of create the expectation that those will be voted down if it happens in the same month, but I don't know. It's just something that kind of occurred.
No, and that's fair, right? And potentially you could propose a DLO saying the work proposals should have I don't know, Long for Wisdom as a candidate, and then we're hoping that the community will come and criticize the DLO to the extent that that this would actually make for a fair competition.
For sure.
But yeah, we agree with you.
I wonder if it's
We
just
thought
saving
about
work. Saving work, preventive, sort of explicitly saying don't do this, right? Rather than relying on the delegates and things to sort of set up that expectation, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. We thought about it. We don't know how much it would be a fair number to wait for everyone else for the competition. That's why we said potentially we can set it at 0 in the very beginning. But yeah, how much should we wait? 2 weeks, 2 months? I don't know. It's at some point it's if no one's coming or there's no competition coming, then you're making everything slow to actually start projects. But yeah.
I think the idea is just to set the expectation for like EAs that like they shouldn't be writing DLOs that like only work for them and specifically like targeted around what they can provide. And they should be written such that like, you know, ideally they represent like the best interests of Maker, right? Because like the idea is that they do the work proposals based on what they can provide, but the DLOs should be, I imagine, should be sort of written primarily to benefit Maker, right?
And maybe to add on to that, if only one solution is proposed, does Maker have to accept it?
No, definitely not. It's up to governance. So, you know, say the government puts out an RFP and they get no responses or bad responses, they don't have to pick any of those. Projects just won't get funded, and if anything, the DLO will expire and have to be renewed. There's no proposals or one bad proposal submitted against it. Patrick, I saw your hand up there too.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of respond to what Long was saying a bit. I mean, I'm not sure how useful those kind of rules would be, because in practice, I could write a proposal and send it to someone else and ask them to post it, and then I can put up my work proposal for that DLO. So you know, it is really easy to circumvent any of those kind of rules. So it might just, which is kind of the issues we've had with lots of things in the past. So whether it's just easier to have it, you know, transparent and open, and then people can judge it for what it is. You know, we've got this work proposal, but hang on, that's the same person that wrote the DLO. Maybe we should think carefully about whether or not we want to accept it.
Yeah, I think it's more about setting the expectation clearly that we don't want that to be the pattern through which this is used. Like whether that's by a direct, like, you know, prohibition, or whether that's just a line in the MIP that says, please don't do this, right? Like this is not how this is intended to be used. Maybe that's enough, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and like Juan said, we're definitely a fan of putting in those sort of restrictions and potential guardrails to the framework. But if we look at the SPF process today, it's one person submitting both the work and the funding request at the same time. And the main goal of introducing these MIPs at this point was to take what we have today, not add too much overhead, but increase the engagement in the correct points, which we thought was clarifying the consensus and then enabling better coordination between the work and the workforce. And then from there, we can evolve it. So things like potentially spamming or having some sort of requirements. I believe Kianga Acre Invest DAO mentioned that in the forum post, as well as creating some sort of potential gating or endorsement mechanism. Those are all things that I think will improve this platform type MIP in the future, but for today's purposes, it's almost a situation of, do you put in your spam prevention beforehand, or do you wait until it's an issue in order to evolve it, especially with the context of trying to get a better vehicle in place to coordinate 17 diverse teams to produce similar work, but then also support their independent path forward.
So, sorry, one related thing, and then I'll shut up. So, I might have missed this when I read it, but have you considered that like there needs to be some sort of like timeline defined for like when proposals are expected, right? So like, you know, if one proposal comes in like 1 month after, right, then governance are comparing it against nothing else, you know, and there might be like another one in month 3 or month 4 or something. So should there be a sort of a timeline to say like, you know, the deadline for proposals is 3 months after the date of this DLO passing, at which point governance will evaluate all proposals in competition, right, in comparison to each other.
Yeah, I definitely think that's an important thing, and I think with the way that the MIP is structured today, there's the available option for authors to require that within the text. I think from a MIP editor standpoint, as written, I know the team may not have a ton of time to spend with it, but putting in those sort of like delays or expectations, it could be bespoke per DLO, but yeah,
yeah, I can see that potentially.
Yeah.
This wouldn't apply for everything.
Also, there could be several work proposals attached to a DLO. Like, for example, we could say we want DAI to be integrated across the world, or in, I don't know, developing countries. and then someone could apply with a work proposal saying we'll do LATAM. The other one could be like we'll do APAC. So potentially more than one work proposal could fit, or actually more than one could be at the same time working for the same DLO without actually competing.
Yeah, I think I'm just like saying, if you want to encourage competition, you have to give like time for it to manifest, I guess, right? Rather than accepting the first proposal or voting on the first proposal before you've potentially seen others.
Yeah, and I think it's also appropriate for delegates to provide that feedback during RFC to say, hey, I wouldn't recommend submitting this. Me and my X amount of MKR isn't going to vote because we want to see some other options. And again, allow it up to that somewhat democratic process to solicit feedback, understand it, and actually have it impact the RFC process then in a meaningful way.
So there's an RFC period for the DLO where the DLO gets refined. And then I think that's basically the same question that Long had. I can specify the period for like, there's basically like a request for proposal, right? And then I can specify this amount, this time window where proposals can surface. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me find the slide real quick. But yeah, in the DLO example, then there's two timelines to keep in mind. There's the expiry of the DLO itself. So that's basically like the open submission window for work proposals to be submitted and have teams win. And then there's a separate timeline for the work to be delivered. So one example could be, say, a growth focused DLO. We want to attract X many users. The DLO itself is open for 1 year. So that means teams have the opportunity to solicit the DAO and win the opportunity to deliver the work. But the DLO itself is scoped as 1 month. So that could be something like, a 1 month targeted campaign for some specific meta concept or just overall branding or something like that. The open window for that campaign to start and be delivered is, a year. But once an agreement is started with a workforce team, they only have 1 month to deliver for that example. But those would be the two levers then that governance and delegates would potentially have to correctly shape the priorities and concerns of the DAO. One additional feature too that I wanted to highlight here too, going back to Juan's point of potentially having multiple work proposals submitted against one DLO. If a DLO requires some sort of cross-core unit collaboration, this isn't a primary focus, but something that can come from it is that the handoff between teams was potentially a little messy or just not overall efficient. What the DLO structure then potentially enables is that multiple teams can work in a collaborative sense, but it's based on milestones. So then teams aren't necessarily over-investing or wasting time until the reporting and the actual deliverable feeding into their milestone is then delivered, which would, in a sense, kind of tag them in to start delivering work against it. Again, it's this platform concept, and that's why we want to include this section of best practices, which is currently still marked with a work in progress. That's something where I am looking for feedback as well. If I think that it's a powerful concept, but I do think we still need to play with it a little bit. So I'm not against dropping it and potentially adding it in later, but open to any feedback there as well, or clarification of the intent of it, because I know it isn't spelled out too well right now.
Yeah, I think it will be really cool to have some initial DLOs put up, because I think a lot of the questions can get answered once you actually start doing that. So it's super hard to just game that out.
Yeah, the one example here is, again, intended to be more of a lightweight, just to show some of the mechanisms. But one of the first DLOs that we would look to publish would be more of the ecosystem actor, entity creation fund, where we do a little bit of research. We're able to develop some sort of basically what this example is. setting up the legal and just the bare bones structure, and that could potentially lead into other DLOs then, which talks about some of the other concepts that the Endgame plan has mentioned, which is enabling a 2-year runway and making sure that MKR incentives transition over. One of the first ones then would just be, let's get ecosystem actors created, and then we can worry about potentially moving over more of the long-term aspects through another vehicle that is potentially a little bit more focused for each one, or allows the core units then to somewhat pitch their business plan of their ecosystem actor, again, in some sort of consistent way.
Wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of like the levers and incentives for accountability, Retro, like using your example here, like let's say a group goes out there, they do a bunch of research, but they come back with a structure that's just like kind of objectively leaves our contributors open to legal liability to use something concrete. Like what then? Like how does the DAO process with work being done substandard, or with even finding out if the work has been done to the deliverables that were described?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I may try to throw it back on you with talking about the arbitration scope a little bit. But in reality, again, these MIPs were designed with one intent in mind, which was focus on the funding mechanisms. Arbitration type concepts of what you're describing, I believe, are needed, but it was an intentional decision to potentially leave those out or leave them lightweight, just to allow the DAO to continue operating how it has today. So if a signal poll or some other sort of polling would be required to be triggered by a facilitator in the light of an event, that I think would be the best course of action today, and then maturing that out is both needed for endgame, but would also pay dividends then in the short run for DLOs as well.
So I have comments on this as well, but I don't want to take up a huge amount of time. So one of the things I kind of thought when I was reading through, which kind of similar to what Peyton was describing, is that I feel like you need like a representative, I think, on behalf of governance, like similar to like, I mean, I know sort of you've done like the auditors and things frameworks separately, which is maybe fine. And maybe that fits into this, but I sort of feel like you need, so the situation you're describing, right, like where arbitration goes to governance and things, you have the ecosystem actor like laying out their case for why they've done the thing. Like who is laying out the case that, you know, on behalf of the DAO, that it doesn't meet what's in the DLO. Because sort of leaving that to delegates, again, it's kind of, I mean, it would maybe work, but it is sort of lazy and not sort of super, not lazy, but like it's in a bad way, right? But like expecting the delegates to do that is sort of, it's not terribly reliable that they will, at least not consistently. So, I mean, my sort of idea was that maybe in the DLO framework, you define a point of contact, you know, like connected to the DLO, who is then sort of the point of contact for, you know, essentially on the side of the DAO, who can like, who sort of handles like the sort of day-to-day work stuff, right? Like I think in most of the cases where, like I was working with EAs as like a facilitator of Go Alpha, it was pretty much always necessary to kind of define like a product owner or like a person on Maker's side who sort of could describe and kind of clarify like what worked and what didn't, and what made sense and what didn't. I know the sort of idea is for all of that to be kind of well documented in the DLO, but I don't think it's kind of possible to cover everything in those sorts of documents. So yeah, I guess I'm just, yeah, I suspect a system like with a representative of the DAO connected to DLO would potentially work better. But yeah.
Well, you're kind of putting out like a, go ahead, sorry, Richard.
No, please.
I was just going to add in there along that you're kind of pointing out this like kind of missing link, I guess, too. Like if the people we're expecting to fill these out are, you know, truly wanting to be ecosystem actors, wanting to participate in this new system, like it's quite possible that we'll have a DLO that they start pursuing in earnest and say, oh, okay, well, we're going to have to pivot because this thing isn't quite working. We think this system design still specifies, you know, all the things that were laid out in the DLO MIP, but we want to be sure, right? We don't want to bring something bad to governance. Like the first thing they're going to do is reach out to probably someone like Patrick and I and say, hey, does this still count? And then we're kind of put in that awkward system of arbitration, or I guess even before like necessarily the community's been let down, right? You could just have a situation where someone who's trying to participate wants to do it in good faith and just doesn't know if what they have in mind still counts for what they've proposed to the DAO.
And I think what you both are describing is a good application of CVCs or DVCs that the endgame will be introducing, the pregame constitution will be introducing. And if we look at this through the lens of organizational change, this is really creating demand for that new structure, or giving them an opportunity to build and coalesce and debate, provide value through the assessment of DLOs. What you're also describing then is the facilitator DAO being that point of contact for the CVCs to kind of assess the work. So we see those structures emerging, and those are a little bit more long run. So similar to how work-based budgeting will be potentially feeding into scope and framework funding, we would see those next mechanisms that you're describing as the lead into the quarterly meetings and facilitator DAOs running budgets. I don't think it's inappropriate for a DLO to be written then for a core unit or a workforce team to basically play vendor manager. And potentially then, if some of this work needs an expert group to assess it more readily on the behalf of Maker governance, that can be a requirement then, stating the workforce requirement is you have to have this expertise, you have to be a core unit, and this work is dedicated then through a vendor and ecosystem actor, just as a workaround answer for its current state. But my concern again would be trying to make this framework too heavy, where it may be more appropriate then to create these modular concepts that could be applied in more areas of the DAO, except for instead of just for DLOs.
I mean, just to come back, so I kind of imagine like the members of the scope councils potentially being this thing mostly, right? But the thing that, so I think what you've said is true, right? I think we could see the DVCs doing it, like the scopes, the facilitator DAOs, whoever. The point I think is important, that it's important to define like the responsibility for doing that explicitly, rather than just like sort of leaving it to be picked up by someone. Because we've seen in the past that if you don't define that explicitly, then either the thing just won't happen, or it will happen very inconsistently, and not sort of with different people picking it up, or the same people picking it up and applying different standards to different instances, right? And I don't think sort of defining that sort of like requirement or position would make it less modular, right? Like you could define that position and just sort of say, at the moment this can be anyone, it can be the author of the DLO, whatever, like core unit member, etc. In the future that can expand to be members of the councils, members of facilitated DAOs, like DVC representatives, like whatever. I just kind of think it's important that it's defined that someone needs to do that job of like sort of product owner / like management of these work like EA teams, right? Like from MakerDAO's perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And if that's the appetite of the DAO today, we could definitely snap that section in a lightweight fashion to enable that today, and then mature that out over time. Because again, like our primary focus is just trying to build some pathway for the core units today to have some clarity on funding and expectations, and then from there look to potentially move more funding types over to this model or some other future evolution.
Long, do you think that it would work if we had like people vouching for it? I think we have something similar with the, I forgot the number of the MIP when
the MIP60 stuff, the intangible assets. Yeah.
Yeah. So
potentially, yeah. Like I still think So, so one of the things that we could see that is potentially bad, that may happen without this sort of thing as well, is that if DLOs get passed that like the author writes but doesn't want to take responsibility for, then that's essentially like pushing responsibility for that, you know, for managing the EAs to a core unit or like just the DAO in general. So it has to be picked up by someone, right? By like requiring that there's someone who is like willing to take that role at the start. You know, when the DL is written and passed, you kind of avoid the situation where it's like orphaned, right? Where like it exists, like some working like EA comes to sort of fulfill it, but like no one at Maker is really connected to it because the author's AWOL or just is not interested in managing it. Like, and you just sort of end up with this either a situation where work is pushed to the core units without their consent, which is kind of sucky, or just where the work doesn't get done. So yeah, those would be my arguments, I think. That'll be a second argument.
Just maybe Retro, could you talk a little bit about like, obviously one advantage is structural, right? Compared to the current options that exist for funding, right? This is literally breaking it out into two separate processes for approving work and then approving the labor essentially to get it done. What other advantages do you think these MIPs kind of add in over like say a special purpose fund or MIP14, just a simple DAI transfer?
Where I would be looking to position DLOs is the just enabling, like I said, this concept of like a modular governance where maintenance work is done in one fashion, innovation is done in one fashion, maybe growth is done in another like particular engagement. And the DLOs just really signify like, this is what we're expecting, this is what we're wanting delivered. And again, it's defining the work around consensus and the workforce around coordination. Like that's really what I would kind of label 97 and 98 as. So some other potential features then could be saying like, if we look at the real world asset example from 2022, there was a project within the CMOF group about researching legal structures. Structuring the work around something that's a little bit more deliverable focused, I think makes the core unit work accessible and really unlocks the information that's been siloed within teams or potentially buried in lengthy forum posts to at least put together some sort of catalog then of saying, here's all the work that's going on. It's providing a better layer of transparency. And as different dashboards and toolkits are built out, I think that's what this really lays is the foundation for a functional specification document to say how does this interface look, and then turns governance into a more user experience focused process instead of bureaucracy.
And just to put this into perspective, right? This is built for the end game. I'm assuming. Well, obviously, but if a DLO or DLO does not produce results or fails, then the sub-DAO will falter, and so will the reputation of the ecosystem actor. Am I right to assume that?
Yeah, and I think this really gives the structure for those sort of insights to manifest. So again, I think everybody benefits from having a very disciplined and detailed view of the workforce today and in the future. So when we're talking about that concept of oversight, it's kind of built into the plan. All work has to go through sub-DAOs. So there is that built-in like assessment and oversight function where if the work isn't delivered and the scope doesn't approve it, then the sub-DAO is penalized. What this set is designed around is basically bridging that gap to say, let's move one step closer, but not complete the full loop of what Endgame's creating. So this is maturing the like definition and assignment phases, but the assessment and continuous improvement phases, the next two, if you look at it as a 4-step process, still need to be built and snapped on. And my personal opinion as the MIP author, it's a natural evolution that's coming. Building the first 2 segments of that 4-step process enables us to then be ready and give those teams and concepts work right away if we start to move some of this work over. But again, MIP40s will still exist, SPFs will still exist, and those current mechanisms don't necessarily have the improvements that we're talking about today on this call, which is why I think it's a prime opportunity to create a tool that's up to our current best practices, that lays the foundation for future best practices specific to Endgame, but then also operationally creates value for the teams in the DAO today to incentivize and fund work. And if that sounded just like a bunch of buzzwords, I can try to dumb down the vocabulary. But that's kind of the academic way that I'm approaching this.
And just to make sure I understood it, you said there are some penalties. Well, obviously there's some on the arbitration incentives and penalties of the end game included there. But is that what you're relating to when you're saying that if a DLO is proposed by a sub DAO and then an ecosystem actor maliciously bids on it and it's colluded between the sub DAO and the EA, there's a penalty that's already included in the framework that will punish the sub DAO, and eventually the sub DAO will perish. Is that correct?
Somebody in the Endgame forum brought up that concept too, about like sub DAOs perishing and potentially being offboarded. Like, I think the intent of the sub DAO is to kind of just be like a health indicator of the workforce. So if they're not performing, the token price goes down, potentially new governance moves in and can clean up the sub DAO, kind of like a takeover for an unhealthy business. The penalty concept then, I believe, is only assessed to the sub DAO, and we'll have to work on the concept of how ecosystem actor work is reported, because again, the sub DAO is supposed to be that barrier for like the workforce bureaucracy and back and forth. So then just the work is focused on. So it would probably be an ecosystem scope framework requirement of how ecosystem actor work is tracked. So then sub DAOs have some way to select good vendors, but ultimately the penalties would just fall into the sub DAO from Maker governance, and then sub DAOs themselves and their local governance could come up with their own SLA or penalty system for the teams that they work with. And correct me if I got anything wrong there, Peyton. Long says that there are no sub DAOs at the moment. I don't see these MIPs can take them into account at this stage. Yeah, exactly. So this is built for core units and typically SPF recipients that have a different way of defining work to the DAO.
Yeah,
I think I have
to agree with Long.
I have a question actually. What would be a good reason or maybe a good parameter where an SPF is better suited rather than submitting a DLO?
Hopefully never. SPFs are very, they're very non-restrictive. Maybe that's a good thing. So if you say, hey, I don't know, if someone counts with or has a lot of trust from the community and has maybe 2 minutes to draft something, let's say Long is like, hey, I need money, trust me, this is important, give me 49K. Maybe the SPF is better, but the way we see it is that this would actually force people to have this conversation of what needs to be done, how, and then what can I do to get this this funding to get the work done. So yeah, hopefully this is an improvement. It's SPF 2.0.
Okay, all right. So eventually, at some point, we're all anticipating that this will override SPFs and SPFs will be obsolete in the future.
We have several delegates in this call. I'm kind of curious how you guys are feeling. Like, if someone were to come to Maker right now, is this the type of thing you'd love to see in detail for their proposal, or is something like an SPF still something you'd consider?
Yeah, I think it depends on on the scope of the work. I think SPFs are like pretty simple, so I think they make perfect sense for something that like what Retro referred to as like one-line items. I think if it becomes like something that's so the beauty for me for a DLO, what I really like about it is you define, and please correct me if I'm getting it wrong, like you define the work that Maker is trying to get done, and then you have these kind of submissions of ecosystem actors who say like, hey, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, and in a way, so you have like this kind of matching process at the back end. And I think that's pretty powerful because it doesn't tie work to like one person or unit, but it actually leaves it open to more competition. So I think that's pretty nice.
Yeah, I think another huge advantage, Raf, is that it gives coherence. So for example, I forgot the name of the SPF you posted not long ago with Tim, but basically it was saying like, hey, we need a portal to organize information. So hopefully the DLO looks a little bit more elaborate, and the portal is just step 1 out of 10 or however many steps you need to actually deliver something that produces value. And this would help to eliminate all these MVPs that need a lot of maintenance and are eventually forgotten and left behind. So if you say, hey, the working objective is to have this in this way, then people can start working towards it. So another DLO could be build all the documentation that's needed for it. Another one could be, I don't know, make sure that that videos are done. So you could have several steps or several milestones that you want to hit, and then the work proposals could be done against that, and you could have a more comprehensive way. Right now with the SPF, it's like, hey, I'll do this, and it's like, oh, it sounds like a great idea. And yeah, not to rain on your parade, but maybe if this portal is never used or never filled with actual content, then it will be a really bad idea. And in retrospective, it's like, okay, how could you have done it better? With the DLO, you have this kind of tool which you say, hey, this is just step number 1, but this is the coherent vision that we're planning to submit. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes a lot of sense, and so yeah, like I said, if the ability to expand scope in a meaningful way without attaching like a huge budget that you then have to give out basically all at once is super powerful in my mind.
Derek, I'm not sure if I understand your question. I don't know if Retro.
Yeah. So your point of we're all about increasing transparency and separating the request for work from the work itself. Whereas today's problem or issue that Rune raises is that we have core units, they do the work, and it's a black box, and we don't really have in some cases the ability to dive down into what's actually happening there. So and I may be wrong, but from listening to Rune talk about the Governance Security Council, he was talking about an entity or a position, what may you, that defines work to be done, or I guess takes input from the community and says, hey, we want to do this. And I'm wondering, is there an overlap, or is there a use of similar tools here to say the Governance Security module or team wants something done and others may do it? Is there an overlap, or is that totally different?
No, it could work in the sense that a scope or actually the framework could say, okay, this is what we need done. So for example, we would need, I don't know, a UI to make spells more transparent. So someone could come and say, oh, that's actually great. We want to work on this solution. So here's a work proposal to work on this tool to give more transparency. Someone like, I don't know, Patrick could say, hey, I need, I don't know, someone to help me reviewing the code every week. I think this is going to cost this for the next 6 months. So here's a work proposal to actually fund this contributor. So you could see how you first set the objective, and then you have all the work proposals that fit into that objective for making it long term, or also to actually work as something operational.
Okay.
Which team are you talking about, Long? Feels that like that team would produce DLOs?
The Governance Security Council, right? It sounds like that's the obvious fit. Like that team is kind of directing what happens. So they produce DLOs, those then go out in the public and approved, and then you know, the ecosystem actors come in and submit work proposals for them.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is that these scopes through frameworks produce DLOs which are very actionable, and then EAs and sub-DAOs and anyone can say, hey, I would like to produce this for this DLO. This is how we're planning on doing it. That's a bit the long-term plan.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I like that it also works in the short term, right, with different entities, but can also fit into that like kind of paradigm once endgame is more actioned, I guess.
Yeah, and if you look at the structures of the DAO and the information that we've been handed, appreciating that it could still change, I think it makes the way that I'm kind of drawing it up on the whiteboard right now is a scope framework has articles. The scopes are defined where the primary receives 80% of the annual budget, 20% for the supporting scopes. So now when you're sitting down with the scope meeting, you have some way to say, okay, well, how is that 20% divided? How is the 80% divided against the primaries? These quarterly meetings become, I think, pretty heavily budget focused, but some of the consistent maintenance work that doesn't necessarily need innovation. So going back to Derek's example of the governance and security scope, the omnibus submission process could have a single DLO within the governance security framework. That DLO is on basically a year agreement where a team is providing services to that scope, which is the omnibus process. As teams are then submitting work to submitting work proposals against DLOs, say for other frameworks like real world assets or decentralized collateral, then they would have to budget in the cost in order to produce the spell in their work proposal. But then the governance and security scope themselves would have their own like budget to operate the process. So it's a little bit of like this recursive function where it's like, oh, you know, for the omnibus spell, how much is it going to cost me? That needs to go into the work proposal for one type of project. And then for the DAO management side, it's what does it cost to keep the lights on in this new paradigm that could be built directly into the framework then and make it a part of the actual structure instead of another funding mechanism outside of like the strategy layer. Yeah, to Artem's point, he asked, is there a process to make an ecosystem actor official? I think that's still TBD if there's going to be some sort of like rating system or not. But if I was running a facilitator DAO, I think I'd be trying to make an Angie's List type setup for ecosystem actors regardless.
Yeah, and I was going to say I think there are separate things. One is a funding tool that we're trying to create, which is ideally an improvement from what we have. But if you wanted to start, I don't know, a month ago, you could have your own company and then propose an SPF if this tool, I don't know, if you feel that it's not ready or that it's not your liking, you can use the other tools that that governance has to fund. So they are unrelated topics.
I was more curious, what if you aren't requesting the funding, but you already have a business or a company and you actually are requesting to provide a service instead?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think like a DLO could act as like a long-term contract as well, right? So you could have like a 2-year contract for that entity to do a service over that period. So
Yeah,
it'd be the same.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Long.
yeah. The delivery is maintenance work. The deliverable is your actions per month posted to the forum in a spreadsheet kind of thing. Yeah, and to Derek's point too, if the DAO was super bullish on DLOs, we could potentially move MIP40 funding to the DLO model by simply enabling core unit budgets as somewhat a retainer, if you will. MKR can basically follow suit. One DLO could be the MKR framework that's actually voted on then, which in and of itself is its own discussion topic. But yeah, again, it's that platform concept that I really want to reinforce to this group on the call, that it is flexible to both be one-offs, retainers, SLAs, whatever sort of agreement type situation would be best for the opportunity.
Hey, a question for Gov Alpha, Patrick J. So is this going into, being that there's a lot of upcoming budgets for some core unit teams, I believe going from March all the way to June, is this going to be proposed to MKR token owners and delegates in the February or March cycle?
Well, that's up to Retro really when he wants to submit it, but I think February was his target last I heard. But it's important to remember this isn't replacing MIP40. Core units can still request budgets through MIP40 if they want. This is just a different tool for dispersing funding for the DAO.
Yeah, so to answer your question, Frank, I'd never like to piss off Long, but would try to go into this next February cycle. So locking down the MIPs on Wednesday. Do appreciate there are some late edits, but since it's not overly binding and not a core mechanism like the MIP40s would be for the core units, I would feel comfortable pushing it in its current state with a little bit of more polish on it to just simply enable then the funding for some of the immediate things we need with Endgame, and then look to heavily amend it over the next couple cycles.
I was thinking, Retro, that when we did the core unit MIP set with the MIP40, the MIP set came with the first sub proposals at the same time. So it was conditional that the MIP set got approved. So potentially we could start working with the different clusters or interested parties that want to have these things done, and we could kind of like do this feedback where, okay, we are missing this section, or this could be great here, so we could still have the funding being activated by this at the same time. So yeah, I mean, to be defined, but we could potentially delay it if we're going to make it considerably better. We just don't want to delay it just for the fun.
We can amend it using the weekly cycle as well, like for the first period of time after it's passed. I can't remember if it's 1 month or 3 months, but so that's also an option. 3 months, yeah. So we could do that. It's just annoying because I need to do another to write the proposal as well as the amendment.
I'll shoulder all the amendment work. Pinky promise.
I don't mind doing edits too. I just I don't want to like. It's fine. I don't mind doing it. It's fine. Like, it's just,
Yeah, no,
just means
but
another amendment proposal, right?
But I'm definitely with you. Like, there's when I first sat down at this MIP set, I think was a total of 10 to try to say like what's everything that we could do, and that seemed like way too much. So again, looking for feedback. If the delegates here aren't going to support it, would love to hear that in its the close state. But if there is some value that we see from it, we would appreciate the opportunity to start testing it, and then yeah, rapidly iterate the feedback as we move on.
Yeah, to be clear, I think it's positive generally. What's there is good. So happy to see it being improved.
And to Paper's point of being against the funding of ecosystem actors. This necessarily wouldn't solely be focused on that. The DLOs would be separate than the framework. So yeah, if conceptually the framework makes sense in your mind and you would want to see things, say potentially an SPF is submitted and recommend them to make a DLO instead to increase confidence, that's the sort of feedback we'd love to hear. But while we're waiting for any more questions, overall, it seems like we have been receiving some positive feedback. We do have 2 days left. Please feel free to contact me, Discord or through the forum or any other method. This will be the primary focus through Wednesday to get this finished. And yeah, we're so excited to see it take shape, and teams are already reaching out to us to potentially position their future funding requests through it. So we'll continue marching forward and appreciate everybody's time and feedback as always.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Long. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.